know that at least 1/3 of all the human beings in the world today call themselves followers of Karl Marx and live in countries which are Marxist? But less than 100 years ago, Karl Marx was almost unknown, a poor scholar living as a refugee in London and having to be supported along with his wife and children by the contributions of friends. What is the power of the thought of Karl Marx? Marxism has swept through the world and captured the minds and hearts of human beings as only the great religions, Christianity and Islam, have done in human history. Is Marxism then in some respects similar to a religion? No other philosopher or social scientist has ever had a worldwide, international, organized following. We find ourselves coming back to the question, what is the strange commanding power that lies within the thought of Karl Marx? How can the global appeal of Marxism be explained? We can begin to solve this mystery by examining the forces shaping Marx's life in his own time and many places. The closeness of Marx's tie to the philosopher Hegel is symbolized by the year 1818. It is the year in which Hegel was called to a prestigious professorship at the University of Berlin, and it is the year in which Hegel's most famous follower, Karl Marx, was born. At first glance, there is little in the early life of Karl Marx which would lead one to predict that he would develop a philosophy for the rising industrial working class, the proletariat. Marx was born in the beautiful old German city of Trier, in the valley of the Moselle River, surrounded by vineyards and rolling hills. Marx's own family was comfortably middle class, his father being the official lawyer for the High Court of Appeal in the city of Trier. Both of Karl's parents were descended from many generations of Jewish rabbis. But Heinrich Marx, Karl's father, was a French Enlightenment figure, a believer in the gospel of reason and science. When the city of Trier was re-annexed from France by the government of Prussia and anti-Jewish laws were instituted, Heinrich Marx was required to convert to Christianity in order to retain his official position. He was baptized as a Lutheran in 1817, the year before Karl was born. Karl and the other children were baptized as Lutherans in 1824, their mother the following year. Karl attended the local schools, and when he was 17, he traveled by boat down the Rhine River to the University of Bonn, where he registered as a law student. After a year of writing poetry and drinking and dueling at the University of Bonn, Marx transferred, under pressure from his father, to the more sober and studious environment of the University of Berlin. But before returning to school, Marx became engaged to his longtime love from Trier, the beautiful auburn-haired, green-eyed Jenny von Westphalen, whose father, the Baron Ludwig von Westphalen, had for many years had a special fondness for the vital, intelligent young Karl Marx, and had stimulated in him an interest in Homer and in Shakespeare, and also in the ideas of Saint-Simon, the French socialist. These were to be lasting interests of Marx for the rest of his life. When Karl Marx came to the University of Berlin in 1836, the great philosopher Hegel had been dead for 5 years, but his influence in the university and in all of Germany was at its very peak, its very highest. The followers of Hegel were now split into conservative and radical groups. During the entire time that Marx was a student at the University of Berlin, from 1836 to 1841, the radical intellectuals at the university and throughout Germany were depressed and miserable. King Frederick William III of Prussia ruled as a strict reactionary against the currents of freedom which had been set loose by the French Revolution. Both liberals and radicals had had great hopes for his son, Frederick William IV, but he soon turned out to be a more efficient and shrewder reactionary than his father had been. Prussia was now an authoritarian police state. Censorship of the press, censorship of public meetings, and a central commission for the suppression of dangerous thought throughout Germany made any movement for reform impossible. Marx soon immersed himself in the works of Hegel, forgot about studying the law, and became one of the leaders of the radical intellectual group called the Young Hegelians. How had the political conflict in Prussia turned into the bitter conflict between the two camps of the followers of Hegel? Hegel was the dominant intellectual voice in Germany, and the conflict about Hegel came from the deep ambiguity, the two-sidedness, the paradoxical, ironical double meanings of Hegel himself, which we have already seen. On the one hand, Hegel had enshrined the Christian Germanic state of Prussia as the highest point, the culmination of all of human history. But on the other hand, Hegel had presented a theory of dialectic as endlessly restless, negating whatever exists in order to bring about change and development toward greater rationality. The Young Hegelians took the radical side of this two-sidedness of Hegel. They argued that the Prussian state, which was in fact becoming daily more restrictive and authoritarian, was not immune to the negative critical power of dialectic and must itself be criticized and attacked. Another ambiguity within the legacy of Hegel was hotly argued by the right-wing and the left-wing Hegelians. On the one hand, Hegel had nothing but contempt for political liberalism and for its twin components of individualism and democracy. For Hegel, the state has absolute power and moral authority over the individual. But on the other hand, Hegel's philosophy of history flew the flag of freedom. It had claimed that the true meaning of human history is that it is the progress of finite spirit in the consciousness of its own freedom. The Young Hegelians took the radical side of this Hegelian two-sidedness, and they called for freedom against the Prussian state. A third instance of ambiguity within Hegel, his two-sidedness or double talk with regard to God. As we have seen, Hegel's metaphysics or theory of reality was a breathtaking vision of reality as absolute spirit or mind, of a God who was the absolute totality of rational truth, of all conceptual rationality. But on the other hand, Hegel acknowledged that God has no existence except in the human sphere. God exists only as he is revealed, manifested, externalized, and embodied in human consciousness, in finite minds, in social institutions, in the course of history. The Young Hegelians took the radical side of this ambiguity about God, and they worked their way finally to the conclusion of atheism, that a God who exists only as human consciousness does not exist at all. And still another double meaning had been left by Hegel, the famous statement that the real is the rational and the rational is the real. The conservative Hegelians and the radical Hegelians waged war over this formidable and tormenting statement. The conservative camp took the first half of Hegel's statement, the real is the rational, and they interpreted it to mean that whatever exists is necessary in the rational process of dialectic, which embodies the absolute. Therefore, to try to change what exists, to change the status quo, specifically to try to change or undermine the Prussian state, is to go against the rational process of dialectic and to go against God, who is embodied in the state and also in the king. But on the other side, the radical camp took its stand on the second half of the statement, the half that said the rational is the real. They protested violently, these radicals, that Hegel never meant to defend the status quo. He never meant to say that whatever exists, no matter how confused or unworthy, is rational. What Hegel meant, according to the Young Hegelians, was that only what is rational has a claim to be called real, and that the most important task of the philosopher is to criticize all social institutions so that they can become more rational and therefore more real. Criticism became the slogan of the Young Hegelians. We can now begin to see the powerful influence upon the thought of Marx which was exercised by the Young Hegelians, these radicalizers of the philosophy of Hegel. Against the sanctity of government and of the Prussian state, they called for continuing the process of dialectical negation in order to reach to a higher and better form of government than the Prussian state. Against political absolutism, they called for progress in freedom. Against a God who exists only in human life, they defended atheism, the denial of the existence of God. Against defending whatever exists as rational and divinely ordained, the young Hegelians shouted that what exists must be criticized so that it can be made rational, more rational, by violent revolution if necessary. All this was proclaimed by the young Hegelians on the basis of their reading of Hegel. Hegel's own viewpoint, as we have seen, was not radical or activistic like theirs. His viewpoint was conservative and quietistic, but the young Hegelians were motivated to find a radical message in Hegel, and they were correct in finding it. What they discovered was that Hegel, as we have seen, was the master of paradox, irony, and two-sidedness. There was indeed a conservative and also a radical side of Hegel. The young Hegelians took the side which gave them intellectual support. But these feisty young radicals were not satisfied with merely reinterpreting the philosophy of Hegel. They were vigorously pushing ahead on three main intellectual fronts. First, with the notion of criticism. Their slogan of criticism inspired them to write pamphlets and books offering sharp, critical attacks on laws, political thought, philosophy, and religion. Marx, by now, had become an extremist among the young Hegelians at the University of Berlin, and he seized upon intellectual criticism as the crucial means by which to change the world. But Marx will soon change his mind on intellectual criticism as the most effective weapon with which to change the world. Instead of theoretical intellectual criticism, the ultimate weapon to change the world will be for Marx the industrial working class, the proletariat. A second front in the campaign of the young Hegelians was derived from their criticism of Hegel's two-sided concept of God. A God who exists only as human consciousness, only in the form of man, does not exist. Therefore, the young Hegelians were atheists. But they drew a far more interesting conclusion from their criticism of Hegel's concept of God. If all of the absolute's development of rationality is within the human sphere, is carried out by man, then man is the true God. It is the human being who is the true divinity. Man is God. This intoxicating and grandiose concept led to the third front of the Hegelians, the young Hegelians campaign. Man's divinity, his godlike nature, has not yet been realized. What must be accomplished is a revolution, a worldwide revolution against the existing conditions of the world, so as to make the world one in which the human being can live as a god. The third front is the concept of a necessary coming world revolution, a huge world catastrophe by which the institutions of the world will be destroyed, so that they can be reconstructed according to the philosophy of Hegel when it is truly interpreted. These three fighting fronts of the campaign of the young Hegelians, the power of merciless criticism as a political weapon, the concept of the divinity of man in place of God, and the view of a necessary impending horrible world revolution, destroying so as to reconstruct a rational world order. These three themes Marx incorporated from his years with the young Hegelians at the University of Berlin. They remain permanent themes within his developing thought. Marx finished writing his doctoral dissertation in 1841, but before he left the university, a great intellectual bombshell burst upon the young Hegelians. It was the publication by Ludwig Feuerbach, who was himself one of the young Hegelians, of a work called The Essence of Christianity. In this work, Feuerbach condemns the philosophy of Hegel as a disguised attempt to restore Christianity. Whatever is of value in Hegel, says Feuerbach, is not what it says about the absolute, but what it reveals about the psychology of man, the human being. Let us, says Feuerbach, cut out the Hegelian double talk about God. Let us place as the basis of philosophy not God or the absolute, but man himself. Man as a species, real material man in a real material world. Marx took away two messages from Feuerbach's attack upon Hegel. One was Feuerbach's materialism, his metaphysical theory that reality is primarily material and not spiritual, as Hegel had claimed. Marx was himself inclined toward materialism in any case. Feuerbach reinforced Marx's own materialistic metaphysics, which now became a permanent element in Marx's thinking. But secondly, Marx took away from Feuerbach the message that the philosophy of Hegel is still true, that when Hegel is turned upside down, when it is seen that Hegel is revealing man's life in the material world rather than God's manifestations, Hegel is still the master. Marx will apply Hegel's dialectic and many of Hegel's concepts to the life of human beings in the concrete material world. After Marx was given a doctorate in philosophy by the University of Jena, Marx moved to the University of Bonn, where Bruno Bauer, a young Hegelian and a close friend, held a teaching post and had encouraged Marx to try for one too. But by 1842, the Prussian Minister of Education condemned the Young Hegelians as an illegal group, and Bauer was dismissed from the University of Bonn. Nor was there any future for Marx there, no. Marx moved on to the city of Cologne, where he became for a while editor of a liberal journal, the Rhineland Times. But Marx's powerful, uncompromising, fierce, radical contributions to the journal soon brought official censorship down upon the journal, and Marx was forced to resign. There is a description of Marx as he appeared while he was functioning as editor of the journal. Karl Marx from Trier was a powerful man of 24 years old, whose thick black hair sprung from his cheeks, nose, arms, and ears. He was domineering, impetuous, passionate, full of boundless self-confidence, but at the same time deeply earnest and learned, a restless dialectician who, with his restless Jewish penetration, pushed every proposition of young Hegelian doctrine to its final conclusion, and was already then, by his concentrated study of economics, preparing his conversion to communism. Marx is surely recognizable from this description, written by one of the wealthy liberal businessmen of Cologne who funded the journal. The businessman goes on to say with regret, under Marx's leadership, the newspaper soon began to speak very recklessly. In a short time, the journal was officially banned. In April of the following year, 1843, Marx was married to Jenny von Westphalen. In her own right, the beautiful patrician Jenny had become a legendary figure of courage, intelligence, fidelity, and suffering. They moved to Paris in November, where they lived from 1843 to 1845. Why Paris? By now it was clear to Marx that German censorship and reactionary politics would silence him. He could say or do nothing of political consequence in Germany. He had lost interest in his young Hegelian friends at the University of Berlin, and the movement itself had been banned. Specifically, he was drawn to Paris by the offer of a job, assisting Arnold Rüger, a friend, with the editing of a new journal in Paris, which was to be called the German-French Annals, and which hoped to print both German and French radical literature. Marx quickly accepted the job. In a letter to Rüger in the summer of 1843, in which he said, I am tired of this hypocrisy and stupidity. I am tired of having to bow and scrape and invent safe and harmless phrases. In Germany, there is nothing I can do. In Germany, one can only be false to oneself. But there was another reason for the choice of Paris as the next stage in Marx's years as a radical exile and refugee from hostile governments. Paris, of all the great capital cities of Europe, was at this time the most hospitable and the most tolerant of all shades of political opinion. Paris provided a rich and exciting intellectual atmosphere, especially for the refugees and exiles from repressive states and churches, from Germany, Russia, Italy, Poland, Hungary, all of whom were busily engaged in literary, artistic, and political activities on behalf of freedom for all humankind. At the same time, France was undergoing rapid and socially disruptive change as the Industrial Revolution advanced through the country. The mass production and the mass distribution of the Industrial Revolution was driving out small business and making factory hands of growing numbers of the French population. The government of France was weak and corrupt and controlled by the newly created wealthy industrialists and financiers. Discontented factory workers throughout the South were engaging in riots and strikes. In this intensely stimulating atmosphere, Marx met Friedrich Engels, who was to become his lifelong friend, colleague, and financial benefactor. He met also the Russian anarchist Michael Bakunin, later his enemy, and he spent much time with French socialist theorists, especially with the socialist anarchist Pierre Proudhon, who also became an enemy of Marx's in very short order. The 1840s in Paris, before 1848, the year of the revolutions across the face of Europe. This period was a period of rapid development of French radicalism. Marx himself had little use for most of the French radicals. Some of them he suspected of lusting to bring about a bloodbath. Some were maverick Catholic priests whom he distrusted, but most of them he considered to be utopians, by which Marx meant that they were concocting theories of improving society which could never be actualized. They remained and would always be pie in the sky. Marx's Paris years, from 1843 to 45, were the crucial years of his intellectual development, not so much because of the stimulation of Parisian intellectual life, but because during this period, Marx fixated upon two questions, which he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. The first question was, why had the French Revolution failed? Why is it that Europe was no closer to freedom now than it had been before the revolution took place? The Age of Enlightenment had been naive to think that the world could be changed by reason, by science and education. But the Jacobin part of the revolution were also proved false by attempting to change the world through the reign of terror. Nor was there value in Hegel's viewpoint that the French Revolution had failed because the time was not yet ripe for the dialectic to reach the stage of freedom, since Hegel had given no indication as to how to tell when the time is ripe for revolution. What can be now known so that a new revolutionary strike for freedom will not fail? The second question which Marx was determined to answer was, what is the significance of the new industrial revolution, the great revolution of technology in factories, mills, mines, and agriculture, which transformed the social, economic, and political life of the world, bringing with it great wealth to some and widespread poverty and alienation to others, as Hegel had already noted in his account of civil society. What is the future of the Industrial Revolution? Can the gross inequities which were now visible in France, and even more so in the sooty, unhealthy factory towns of England, can this continue without a revolution to correct this? What is to prevent such a revolution from failing, as the French Revolution had failed? To answer these questions, Marx read with a frenzy while in Paris, plowing through everything written of significance which bore upon these problems posed by the French and industrial revolutions. He taught himself French by reading the works of all the French socialists who were currently celebrities in Paris. He read French and German history in accordance with Hegel's historical approach to the understanding of all human problems. And in order to deal with the economic problems connected with the Industrial Revolution, he read all the major economic theories in the field, from those of the 17th century to his own time, and most carefully Adam Smith's great work, The Wealth of Nations. From all that he read, he made copious notes of long passages, some of which he incorporated into his own manuscripts. This was to become a lifelong practice for Marx, the omnivorous reading, the endless note-taking, the great outpouring of manuscripts, many of them unfinished. Here in Paris, Jenny's first baby was born, and while she and the baby returned to her family in Trier for 2 summer months, Marx produced the work which is now called the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, or the 1844 manuscripts. In these manuscripts is contained Marx's economic interpretation of history, a key concept of Marxism which received its full treatment only in his last great work, Capital. Meanwhile, the French-German Annals, the radical journal which Marx and Ruge co-edited, was seized in Germany, and warrants were issued for the arrest of Marx and Ruge. The first issue of the journal was also its last. Soon afterwards, Marx became a contributor to another radical journal called Forward, and this led to Marx's being expelled from France. Marx was given 24 hours to leave Paris. Jenny sold their furniture and left the city a few days later. Next stop on the refugee trail, Brussels in Belgium. In the Brussels period, from 1845 to 1848, Marx began to organize an international revolutionary group, and he soon joined with English radicals in an organization called the Communist League. Marx became the leader of this rapidly growing revolutionary organization, and in 1847, the Communist League commissioned him to write a document which would state the aims of the organization. Marx completed the statement of principles for the Communist League, and it was published a month before the outbreak of the Paris Revolution of 1848. It was the now famous Manifesto of the Communist Party. Marx was soon expelled for this from Brussels, returned to revolutionary Paris, and moved on to Germany, where the revolution of 1848 was just now breaking out. But with the failure of the German Revolution, Marx was deported once again from Germany. Jenny pawned the silver she had inherited from her aristocratic English grandmother, and with this money they left Germany for the last time. They tried to go back to France, but were forbidden to live in Paris, and so the Marxes moved to London. Marx was now 31, Jenny was 35. London was to be their home for the rest of their lives. They lived in poverty, misery, and ill health. 3 of their children died for lack of money to pay for medical care. Yet Marx continued to write and plan for the world revolution, which he did indeed bring about, but was fated never to see. What is the power of Marxism? Next time, we shall probe into the developed thought of Karl Marx.
Pre-recorded in the studios of the Maryland Center for Public Broadcasting.